And we're coming up to Robert Burns. Celebrations, of course. Robbie Burns, the Scottish poet. And Burns Day is this coming Friday, and I'm sure next weekend will be filled with Burns dinners and addresses to the haggis and all that sort of thing. So I thought it would be a great time for Spencer Stuart to drop by and talk about an iconic Robert Burns book. Spencer Stuart manages people's collections in Vancouver and further afield than that, whatever it is you're collecting. And he has a special interest in books and lots of stories behind iconic books. So he came in to talk about the publication that put Robert Burns on the literary map.
That's right. This is the Kilmarnock volumes, as it's known, or the Kilmarnock Burns, and it's the first appearance of any of his prose. It was published at the end of July of 1786, and it's basically his poetry debut. He was known prior to that for reciting poems in the pub, and he had some manuscripts sort of scribbling down some ideas, but he'd never actually printed them as such. And so this is the first appearance of them in a printed form.
So why did it happen at this particular time?
Yeah, so he's sort of he's on the run in a sense. He's
in a real sense, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah, in a true sense. Yeah, he has debtors. He's
dalliances,
terrible family troubles, and he's looking to make it to the West Indies, where a job was offered to him to be an assistant on a plantation, sort of a bookkeeper. And in order to do that, though, so the story goes, he had to secure passage. He had to make his own way. So that's one theory we have about why the Kilmarnock volume came into existence.
To try to make some money.
That's right. So there are two. The first one is that he published it in order to make some money to secure his passage. And it took off, and that resulted in him staying. There's other evidence, though, of a letter that he wrote in April of 1786, after knowing that he was going to be trying to make his way to the West Indies, in which he says he's publishing it just as one last foolish thing to do before he goes. He refers to it as kind of a bit of a lark. So it's never entirely clear. Burns in his correspondences, he's always like, he's kind of a scoundrel. He's concealing information.
Just like in life, it seems.
Precisely, yeah. It's extremely consistent. So what happens is either way, there is a suggestion that's made by his friend Gavin Hamilton, who subsequently the Kilmarnock volume was dedicated to publish some of his poems. And so he, in Kilmarnock, he approaches a printer by the name of John Wilson. And John Wilson's kind of an interesting figure. He's almost the same age as Burns. They're in their late 20s at this time. He'd been running a printing press for a little less than 10 years. And he was starting up a business. He would have been approached as a job printer, basically, someone who prints pamphlets or invitation cards, things of this nature. He wasn't a publisher by any stretch of the imagination. So he wasn't doing any editing or manipulating of the text. And prior to publishing Burns's poems, he was publishing mostly religious pamphlets. He published about 13 things prior to that point, all of which were of this kind of new Presbyterian movement that was taking place in Scotland at the time. And so it was quite orthodox writing. So, already they're sort of at odds in a funny way. Here's Burns, who comes in, and most of his stuff is secular, in 1786 he approaches them, and they start to get to work. And what he does is, Wilson, he basically sets up a situation where Burns needs to get subscriptions in order to cover the costs of production before he even starts to do any work for him.
Okay.
He wasn't sure if this was going to fly. And so Burns goes around with subscription lists. He makes about 96 of them. And what's important about them is that he puts his name to the work. He doesn't talk about John Wilson being involved at all. It's really kind of a pet project in a way. And from this list, you see friends and kind of financial backers get behind him. He sells close to 350 advanced subscriptions. What's interesting, though, is that of the people that purchased the later run, which is about 615 volume, or 615 printings. It was 2/3 of them are about 7 people.
Oh,
which were all people he knew,
and they just bought lots.
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, you can see that as wow, he really had good friends, with deep pockets.
Right, in spite of all his shenanigans.
Exactly. Yeah. I guess he was sort of a character they wanted to be around in a way, but what you also see is people cashing in on a good thing, right? So it starts off and it's 3 shillings to purchase them, and people are buying them in bulk, and we can only assume selling them to local people. That was really that was the first readers of the Kilmarnock Burns are kind of local farmers and people of this nature.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so did it go in, obviously, then what happened with that original publication? Where did it go from there?
Yeah, so, it comes out in the end of July, and it's 615 copies. And it sells out in a matter of weeks. And it immediately gathers the attention of other publishers, including one William Creech, who was a publisher in Edinburgh at the time. And he's effectively, without him, the idea of the Scottish Enlightenment wouldn't have taken place. He was a kingmaker, and he knew a good thing when he saw it. And so, what's interesting to notice is that Burns, he sees that it's a success. He comes back to John Wilson and says, "Hey, how about let's get the printing going again?" And Wilson, for one reason or another, there's some theories that he may have had pressure from some of the religious community in the Kilmarnock region, said, no, we have to do a subscription model again. So he had to go back and get all these names in order to cover the production costs to get the printing going. And Burns was he was upset by that. And he basically looked for, greener pastures, effectively. And using connections with the Masons, he was able to get in contact with William Creech, who was familiar with the poems. They were already getting reviews, and people were talking about him as being, a pretty exceptional writer. And also just the idea that it was in the Scottish dialect was something that was, extremely rare at the time. And at a time where you see Scottish national identity really increasing, and it only increased further as it went into the 19th century. Really, the time where you start to see it form in its fully mature state.
So a real hunger for that voice, for that authentic,
absolutely
nationalist voice in that way.
Yeah, and there's it's an interesting period of time for Scottish publishing as well. At the beginning of the 1700s, with the Union, there are some issues with access to British writers, and there was all these taxes that were royalty costs effectively applied to publishers at the time in Scotland. And those were alleviated in the middle part of the 1700s. And what it did is it opened up the publishing industry, obviously in Scotland, and it exposed people to some of the great writers of English writing. And Burns, as a kid, was exposed to people like Milton and Shakespeare and things like this. And so he and his parents were real advocates of it. And so he kind of is raised at the right place, right time in terms of being exposed to forebears, and then what he was capable of.
How interesting to think of it starting, though, in that, like you say, going to this jobber, and who would be like, "Oh, yeah, okay, we'll see."
What's so interesting, though, is that John Wilson uses this opportunity to actually make quite an unbelievable piece of work. It's interesting to take a look at Kilmarnock volumes. There's a lot of ornamentation on the side of the page. And it's funny, one scholar has actually connected these ornaments back to a printer in Edinburgh in the 1750s who used them to embellish some of the great writers of British writing. So, someone like John Milton. And so they were a bit old-fashioned by the time they were used in 1786 and, decorated the pages of Burns, but would have been read as, within Scotland at least, kind of aligning him with a canon already, to say, hey, this is the new voice, and already he is, in a sense, a literary giant.
Interesting.
Which is just and so there's all these kind of myths around Burns as well as a person. He shows up almost immediately after the publishing to Edinburgh and starts to spend time with some of the intelligentsia in Edinburgh, and he's seen as a kind of heavenly taught plowman, right? That's what he was referred to as, this kind of gentleman who came out of the rural regions, which was something of an obsession for people in the city.
Who couldn't even conceive of what was out there.
Exactly. And he comes in and he's, not only is he speaking poems, he's conversant with some of the great writers of Western writing too. So he was a bit of a novelty in a way, which is interesting to think about.
Have you seen those books?
I haven't had a chance, no. Although there was a census that was performed in just last year to track down the various copies. So it started with 615 copies. However, there exist only 84. And there's a number of reasons for this. One of which is because it was well loved, and so maybe its first owner, it was read to threads and it kind of discarded in a way, or perhaps left behind. Other cases, it's a book that when it was purchased, it was not bound. It was actually a pile of papers around and stitched in with blue wrappers, so a kind of almost a robin's egg blue, and that was quite common at the time. It usually was expected that someone would go to a binder, and then you get contemporary binding put on it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So basically what would happen is some of these kind of slip through the cracks. If a library is being cleared out,
what's this pile of papers?
Yeah,
Chuck?
Yeah, it starts to go. But the chance of seeing one in Canada is actually relatively high. There's one at the National Library of Canada, and that was given by a British ambassador to celebrate the centennial of Canada. So in 1967 it was put into the collection. There's one at Western. So that one was purchased in around the 1960s as well. And there's also one at the Fisher Rare Book Room in the University of Toronto.
Huh.
So there are 3 in Canada that we know. What's interesting is that most of the Kilmarnock volumes that exist, of those 84, a huge percentage of them, it's about 69 of them, are in institutions. And one of the reasons for that is because as you go through the 1800s, the involvement of American collectors into British books starts to increase. And you start to see people like Morgan, J.P. Morgan and others start to see it as a real feather in their cap. It moves from being something that Burnsians covet to something that is of value within the Western canon of literature. By the time the Grolier Club in New York publishes the 100 titles of Western literature in 1902, the prices for this book are astronomical. Huh. And so it becomes something that's quite rare. And so what ends up happening as well is that with the passing away of a lot of these collectors, they went into institutions. So it's an interesting thing to see in the census. When you look at it, you see that they're most of them are
not in
within
private
archives.
Yeah,
there's about 15, I think, or around that number in private hands.
Huh.
So, yeah.
Spencer, thanks so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
That's Spencer Stuart, and he is a collections manager here in Vancouver. He helps people with the various things they collect. And by the way, the fact that there are only 84 known copies of the Kilmarnock Burns makes it the rarest text in modern English letters. It is 3 times as rare as Shakespeare's First Folio. Some music now, based on poetry by Burns.